Gabe saw the Great Pyramid and got thirsty. Maybe it was all the sand, so dry and yellow. It seemed to stretch on forever. It even made the sky look dry. He poked his mum in the side and told her, really, that he was thirsty. She had one hand up on her forehead, shielding her eyes from the bright sun as she stared up at the enormous pyramid, and she said, "Not now, not now." What did not now mean? He was thirsty now. Someone bumped him from behind and apologized in a foreign language. He never dreamed that when he finally saw the Great Pyramid, there would be so many other tourists. It seemed like half the people in the world had decided to spend their Christmas vacation in Egypt that year. He tried again, telling his mom his throat was so dry. She answered that they could not get him a drink right now, still staring at the pyramid. She told him to stop acting like he was 4, reminding him he was 12. He muttered that 12-year-olds got thirsty too, and that all the sand in the air was making him gag. She told him to look at the pyramid, sounding a little irritated. That was why they had come, after all, not to get a drink. He cried out that he was choking, gasping and holding his throat for dramatic effect. Okay, so he was not actually choking. He exaggerated a little, just trying to get her attention. But she pulled the brim of her straw hat down and continued to stare at the pyramid as it shimmered in the heat. So Gabe decided to try his dad. As usual, his father was studying the handful of guidebooks he always carried everywhere. He probably had not even looked at the pyramid yet. He always missed everything because he always had his nose buried in a guidebook. Gabe whispered that he was really thirsty, putting a strain in his voice to get the message across. His dad looked up, not at Gabe, but at a picture of the pyramid in his book, and asked if Gabe knew how wide it was. Then he answered his own question, announcing it was 13 acres wide, and asking what Gabe thought it was made of. Gabe wanted to say silly potty. His dad was always testing him. Whenever they went on a trip, his father asked him a million questions like that. Gabe did not think he had ever answered one right. He guessed some kind of stone. His dad smiled and said that was right. Limestone blocks, and that some of those blocks weighed up to 1,000 tons. Gabe said, "Whoa," and then told his dad that was more than him and Mom put together. His dad turned his eyes from the book and frowned. "Not funny, Gabe." Dad was a little sensitive about his weight, so naturally Gabe tried to tease him about it as often as he could. His dad asked how Gabe thought the ancient Egyptians moved stones that weighed 1,000 tons. Gabe shielded his eyes and stared up at the pyramid. It was really huge, much bigger than it looks in pictures, and much drier. He could not imagine how they had pulled those big stones across the sand without wheels. He confessed he had no idea, and mentioned again that he was really thirsty. His dad told him that nobody knew how they did it. A trick question. Then his dad squinted at the pyramid and said it gave you a funny feeling. Did it not? Gabe said it gave him a thirsty feeling, but his dad meant that it was kind of a chill, thinking about how their ancestors, his and Gabe's, may have walked around these pyramids, or even helped to build them. Gabe admitted that was kind of exciting. They were Egyptian, you see. Both sets of his grandparents had come from Egypt, moving to the United States around 1930. His mom and dad were both born in Michigan. The whole family had been thrilled to visit the country their ancestors came from. His dad wondered aloud if Uncle Ben might be down inside that pyramid right now. Uncle Ben Hassad. Gabe had nearly forgotten about his uncle, the famous archaeologist. Uncle Ben was another reason they had decided to come to Egypt over the holidays, along with the fact that his parents had some business to do in Cairo and Alexandria and other places. Mom and Dad ran their own business, selling refrigeration equipment. It usually was not very exciting, but sometimes they traveled to interesting places like Egypt, and Gabe got to come along. Gabe turned his eyes back to the pyramid and thought about his uncle. Uncle Ben and his workers were digging around the Great Pyramid, exploring and discovering mummies. He had always been fascinated by their ancestors' homeland and had lived in Egypt for many years. Uncle Ben was an expert on pyramids and mummies. Gabe had even seen his picture once in National Geographic. Gabe asked when they would see Uncle Ben, tugging his dad's arm a little too hard. The guidebooks tumbled to the ground, and Gabe helped pick them up. His dad made a face, not liking to bend over, because his stomach got in the way. He told Gabe not today, that Uncle Ben was going to meet them in Cairo in a few days. Gabe asked impatiently why they could not just go up to the pyramid and see if Uncle Ben was there. His dad replied they were not allowed. Then he pointed and called out that there were camels. Sure enough, some people had arrived on camels. One of the camels seemed to be having a coughing fit, as if it too were thirsty. The tourists riding them looked very uncomfortable and did not seem to know what to do next. Gabe asked his dad if he knew how to get down from a camel. His dad squinted up at the pyramid and said no. How? Gabe delivered the punchline. You do not get down from a camel. You get down from a duck. It was a very old joke, but Gabe and his dad never got tired of it. His mom asked if he saw the camels. He told her he was not blind. Being thirsty always put him in a bad mood. Besides, what was so exciting about camels? They were really gross looking and smelled like his gym socks after a basketball game. His mom asked what his problem was. Fiddling with her straw hat, he told her he was thirsty, not meaning to sound so angry. She glanced at his dad and went back to staring at the pyramid. Gabe perked up and asked his dad enthusiastically whether Uncle Ben could take them inside the pyramid. That would really be outstanding. His dad said he did not think so, raising his binoculars to his eyes, explaining that he did not think it was allowed. Gabe could not hide his disappointment. He had all these fantasies about going down into the pyramid with his uncle, discovering mummies and ancient treasures, fighting off ancient Egyptians who had come back to life to defend their sacred tomb, and escaping after a wild chase, just like Indiana Jones. His dad said Gabe was afraid he would just have to appreciate the pyramid from the outside. Gabe told him glumly that he had already appreciated it, and asked if they could please go get a drink now. Little did Gabe know that in just a few days his mom and dad would be gone, and he would be deep inside the very pyramid he was staring at. Not just inside it, but trapped inside it, sealed inside it, probably forever. The real trouble began not at the pyramids, but in a cramped little hotel room in Cairo, where 12-year-old Gabe found himself utterly, completely, terrifyingly alone. The drive back from Algiza had been uncomfortable enough. Gabe's dad had rented a car so small that Gabe's head bounced off the ceiling at every bump in the road. His mom made him put away his Game Boy so he could admire the Nile, which Gabe observed was very wide and very brown. A river, he figured, was a river. Things got worse when Dad made a wrong turn, and the family spent nearly half an hour trapped in a narrow alley behind a herd of goats. By the time they reached the hotel, Gabe's tongue felt, as he put it, about the size of a salami. The Coke he got back at the hotel, cold and full of ice he could crunch with his teeth, was the one genuine comfort Egypt had offered him so far. But comfort had a short lifespan that evening. The phone rang while they were discussing dinner, and Dad slipped into the bedroom to answer it. He called Mom in after a moment, and the two of them spoke in the careful, hushed tones that parents use when they are discussing something they do not want their child to hear. Gabe knew those tones well. He was, as usual, right to be suspicious. They emerged from the bedroom, wearing identical expressions of strained concern. His first fear was that something had happened to Elvis, their cocker spaniel, back home. But the news was different. His parents had to leave for Alexandria immediately. Business. An important customer. A plane departing in an hour. Gabe did not take this quietly. He jumped off the couch and argued with everything he had. They had promised him Cairo. They had promised him the pyramids. They had promised him Uncle Ben. His parents tried to sell him on Alexandria, insisting it had plenty of worthwhile things to see. But Gabe held his ground with the stubbornness only a 12-year-old can truly sustain. Then Mom had an idea. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a phone call's worth of good news. Uncle Ben, the coolest man Gabe was pretty sure he had ever known, and his mother's brother was already staying nearby at a small lodge in Algiza. He had agreed to come and look after Gabe while his parents were away. For approximately 1/18 of a second, Gabe weighed his options. He chose Uncle Ben without hesitation. Then Mom added the condition. Sari was also on Christmas vacation, and Sari was staying with Uncle Ben too. Gabe flung himself onto the couch and began pounding the cushions with both fists. Sari was his only cousin. She was 12, same as him. She was smart. She was pretty, and she absolutely knew it. She went to boarding school in the United States while her father worked in Egypt, and the last time Gabe had seen her, she had been a full inch taller than him. She was the most competitive person he had ever encountered in his life. She had to win at everything, at every game, at every contest, even at catching the flu. The memory of her beating him at Super Mario Land still stung, though Gabe maintained it was not a fair comparison since she had a Super Nintendo and he only had the regular kind. Still, after a brief internal struggle, he made his choice. He would stay. He would endure Sari. Uncle Ben was worth it. Mom and Dad packed in a hurry, gave him instructions he only half listened to, told him to stay in the room, hugged him with the excessive warmth of people who feel a little guilty, and then the door shut behind them and the room went very quiet. Gabe turned the television up just to fill the silence. A man in a white suit read the news in Arabic. The game show he had been watching before was over, and no one on any channel was speaking English except for CNN, which was also news. His stomach growled. He thought about room service and then thought better of it. Worried about what would happen if he called and they only spoke Arabic, he paced. He tried Tetris on his Game Boy but could not concentrate. He looked out the window and watched the shadow of a glass skyscraper stretch across the street in the dying light. And then the thoughts came. The kind that creep in when you are alone in a strange place, and no one you love is anywhere nearby. What if Uncle Ben could not find the hotel? What if he went to the wrong one? What if there was a car crash? What if Gabe was stranded here alone in Cairo for days and days, unable to speak the language, unable to ask for help? He knew they were dumb thoughts, but he kept thinking them. At some point he noticed that he had taken the mummy hand out of his jeans pocket, the way he often did without thinking about it. It was small, the size of a child's hand, wrapped in papery brown gauze, and he had carried it for years as a good luck charm after buying it at a garage sale for $2. The kid who sold it had called it a summoner, claiming it was used to call up evil spirits or something like that. Gabe had not cared about any of that. He had cared about the bargain. He tossed it from hand to hand as he paced, and tried to convince himself that everything was fine. He clicked off the television because it was making him anxious. The silence it left behind was immediately worse, and then he heard footsteps outside the door. He froze in the middle of the living room, staring toward the narrow front hallway. Uncle Ben would knock, he told himself. Of course he would knock. The doorknob turned. The door began to creak open slowly, swinging inward on its hinges, and Gabe stood perfectly still, unable to call out, unable to move. A tall, shadowy figure filled the doorway. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking what it was. Ancient, thick bandages wrapped around a lurching, stiff body, round dark eyes, staring through holes in the wrappings. Arms stretched outward, reaching toward him as the figure pushed into the room and staggered forward. A mummy, walking toward him with its arms outstretched, coming straight for him across the living room floor. Gabe opened his mouth to scream. No sound came out at all. Gabe's heart was still hammering when the truth finally revealed itself. One moment he was backing away from a shambling mummy in the dim hotel room, mummy hand raised in a desperate, trembling defense. The next he was watching his Uncle Ben collapse against the wall in stitches, big booming laughter shaking the whole room, and there was Sari poking her head through the doorway with that wide, superior grin she always seemed to have ready and waiting just for him. They thought it was the funniest thing in the world. Gabe most certainly did not. His heart was pounding so hard, he was convinced it might actually burst free from his chest. He shouted that it was not funny, balled his fists at his sides, and tried to breathe like a person who had not just been scared half out of his skin. He told them he had recognized Uncle Ben right away, that he had known the whole time. Sari, of course, did not believe a single word of it. Uncle Ben laughed until tears ran down his bandaged face. Uncle Ben was a big man, tall and broad, the kind of person whose laughter did not just fill a room but rattled it. He bent down to retrieve the mummy hand Gabe had hurled at him, then stepped over and handed it back. He wrapped Gabe in a rough, gauze, scratchy bear hug and said it was good to see him, that the boy had grown taller. Sari helped her father peel away the bandages, while Gabe quietly scolded himself for falling for it. He always fell for Uncle Ben's jokes, always. And now Sari knew it too, and that somehow made it worse. But then Uncle Ben dropped the news that swept all of that embarrassment clean away. He had discovered a new burial chamber inside the Great Pyramid, a tunnel that did not appear on any chart, unexplored and untouched for thousands of years, and he was going to take them inside. Gabe's voice shot up so high when he asked if that meant what he thought it meant, that it was practically only audible to dogs. He did not care. The thought of walking into the ancient pyramid of Khufu, into a section no one had set foot in since the time of the pharaohs, was almost too enormous to hold in his head. Over dinner in the hotel restaurant, beneath slowly whirling ceiling fans and painted palm trees, Uncle Ben laid it all out. He explained how the pyramid had been built around 2500 BC for the pharaoh Khufu, how it sprawled 13 acres at its base, and how it had been designed as a royal burial place, stuffed with decoys, tunnels, and deliberate confusion to foil tomb robbers. Gabe already knew the measurement of the base from his father's guidebooks and earned a surprised, grudging look from Sari when he said so. 1 point for him. Uncle Ben told them that archaeologists had believed they had already found every tunnel and room inside the pyramid. A few days earlier, that turned out to be wrong, and the new tunnel might lead straight to the actual burial chamber of Khufu himself. Gabe barely slept that night. He lay in the dark imagining mummies and ancient jewels and chests of treasure waiting just beneath the sand. The next morning they drove out through the rising heat to Al Jaza, when Sari spotted the pyramid rising out of the yellow desert like some impossible mirage. The sight of it hit Gabe in the chest, like something physical. He stood in the blue-grey shadow it cast and stared up at those enormous worn stones, trying to wrap his mind around the fact that they were more than 4,000 years old, and that he was about to go inside them. Sari brought him right back down to earth by pointing out that his sneaker was untied. Uncle Ben handed them both flashlights and reminded them sternly to stick together. The tunnels were a real maze, he said, and getting lost was genuinely easy. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that one of his workers believed their entry into the new tunnel had activated an ancient curse. Sari shoved her father playfully toward the entrance. Gabe told himself he was not scared. They stooped through the small square opening and followed the tunnel as it sloped gradually downward. The floor was soft and sandy. The air grew cool, then damp, then colder still, and Gabe understood exactly why Uncle Ben had insisted on the sweatshirts. The granite walls pressed close. Sari asked if he was scared. He said he was fine. The tunnel ended at a pale yellow wall with a dark hole cut into the floor. No stairs, just a rope ladder that one of Uncle Ben's workers had installed, swaying in the darkness below. Uncle Ben groaned down onto his knees and began the slow descent, the ladder swinging unsteadily under his weight, while Gabe and Sari leaned over the edge and watched. In the shadowy light, Gabe caught Sari chewing her lower lip, her expression tight with worry. She was nervous too. That, he had to admit, cheered him up considerably. When Uncle Ben reached the bottom and called up for Gabe to follow, Gabe swung his legs onto the ladder and grinned back at Sari. He slid his hands down the sides of the rope to begin his descent, and the moment he did, he cried out. The rope was coarse and sharp, and it bit into his palms like something with teeth. The sudden jolt of pain made him lift his hands without thinking, and just like that, without a moment to catch himself, or reconsider, or do anything at all, he was falling. Two hands shot through the air and grabbed Gabe's wrists just before he fell. Sari had reached down through the opening in the floor and caught him, slowing his tumbling descent just enough for him to grab back onto the sides of the rope ladder. "Hold on," she had cried, and those two words had saved him. Gabe clung to the ropes with white-knuckled hands, squeezing so hard his palms ached, waiting for his heart to stop hammering. When he finally opened his eyes, Sari's face was inches from his, leaning down through the hole, grinning with relief. She had saved his life, and she knew it, and Gabe knew it too, which stung him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Why couldn't he ever be the hero? Why was it always her? He pushed the thought aside and made his way down the rest of the ladder, one careful rung at a time, Uncle Ben's patient voice rising up from the tunnel floor below. A short while later, all three of them stood together in the darkness, flashlight beams dancing across ancient granite walls. Uncle Ben led them through the tunnel, stooping under the low ceiling, sneakers crunching softly on the sandy floor. Passages branched off to the right and left like the arms of some buried maze. Ben spoke quietly about the air around them, noting that every breath they took was 4,000 years old. Gabe whispered to Sari that it smelled like it, and she laughed. It really did smell old, heavy and musty like someone's forgotten attic. As the tunnel curved and widened, Sari mentioned that she and her dad had found a mummy case in a tiny side room the day before. Beautiful, she said, and in perfect condition. Gabe's eyes went wide. He had grown up staring at the single mummy in the museum back home, studying it, dreaming about it. Was there one inside the case? He asked eagerly. No, Sari told him. It was empty. Uncle Ben paused and delivered a mummy joke with tremendous satisfaction. Why didn't the mummy have any hobbies? Because he was too wrapped up in his work. He laughed uproariously at himself. Gabe and Sari managed only weak smiles. Sari warned Gabe not to encourage him. They squeezed through a narrow passage, heads bent, until it opened into a large high-ceilinged chamber. Gabe stood up straight and stretched, grateful for the space. Bright spotlights had been hung on the far wall, powered by a portable generator, and several workers dug and scraped at the stone beneath them. Standing apart from the group was a man dressed, all in white except for a red bandana around his neck. He had straight black hair slicked into a ponytail, and he held a clipboard. He stared at Gabe and Sari, but did not come over, did not smile, did not speak. He simply watched them with steady, measuring eyes. Uncle Ben called over to him. His name was Ahmed, a man from the university who had requested permission to observe the dig. Ben explained in a low voice that Ahmed was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but that he had one particular obsession. Get him started on ancient curses, Ben said, and he would not stop warning you that you were in deadly danger. Ahmed nodded at the introduction, but said nothing. He just kept staring. Gabe decided the man was deeply weird, but also deeply interesting. Uncle Ben turned his attention to his workers. A young red-haired man in denim said he thought they were getting close. Ben rewarded this with a Quasimodo joke. The workers laughed. A young woman with a dust-smudged face beckoned Ben to a large pile of stones and debris, pointing out something that clearly excited her. Ben leaned in close, rubbed his chin, and fell into a long and serious discussion with her. 3 more workers entered the chamber, carrying shovels and picks. One of them carried a flat metal case that looked something like a laptop computer. Gabe wanted to ask what it was, but Ben was absorbed in his conversation and had effectively forgotten the 2 children existed. Sari crossed her arms and sighed. She said it was always like this once her father got underground with his work. Gabe shined his flashlight up at the cracked ceiling, marveling quietly that they were actually standing inside a pyramid. They kicked at the sandy floor together, joking about ancient dirt. Gabe wondered aloud who might have walked this very spot thousands of years before. Maybe an Egyptian priestess, maybe a pharaoh. Then Sary's dark eyes gleamed with that particular look Gabe knew all too well. She said they should go exploring. Gabe resisted. He reminded her that her dad had told them to stick together. Sary reminded him that her dad had forgotten they were alive. She pointed out that she had explored tunnels the day before, and that all the passages looped back to the main chamber. She began pushing Gabe backwards with both hands, and then she mentioned a carving she had found, some kind of animal on a tunnel wall. Maybe a cat, she said. Maybe a person with an animal head. Really strange. That detail dissolved the last of Gabe's hesitation. He glanced back at Uncle Ben, who was now on his hands and knees picking at the stone wall, completely lost in his work. And when Sary finally looked at him and asked if he was chicken, clucking and repeating the word Gaby in that maddening sing-song voice, any remaining argument Gabe had left him entirely. Fine, he said. They would go, but not far. They gave one last look at Uncle Ben, then slipped out of the chamber. They squeezed through the narrow tunnel, turned right, then took a left branch, where the air grew warmer and stale, smelling faintly of old smoke. The tunnel widened and Sary picked up her pace, moving farther ahead of Gabe with every step. Then his sneaker came untied again. He groaned, bent down, and called after her to wait up. But her light was already shrinking in the distance. Then it curved around a bend and disappeared altogether. He stared into the dark tunnel ahead. He called her name. He called it again. No answer came back through the ancient silence. Sary was gone. Sary had vanished. That was the cold, unsettling truth at the heart of it all, as Gabe stood alone at the entrance of the pyramid tunnel, calling her name into the darkness. His voice came back to him in fading echoes, but Sary did not. At first, anger was his companion. He knew her games. Sary always had to be the brave one, always had to make him look like the frightened, helpless cousin. He had seen this before, and the memory came rushing back to him like a wave. Years ago, when they were 7 or 8, Sary had come to visit with Uncle Ben. She had spent the afternoon showing off with a jump rope, and when Gabe tried his hand at it, he tripped and fell, and she laughed until her sides hurt. So Gabe had plotted his revenge. He led her to a deserted old house a couple of blocks away, a crumbling, creaky place the neighborhood. Kids swore up and down was haunted. Their parents had forbidden them from going near it, which of course made it all the more irresistible. They slipped inside through a broken basement window just as the sky turned dark and the rain began to fall. Thunder rolled in the distance. Lightning split the grey afternoon. It was perfect. Gabe could see the fear creeping into Sary's eyes, and he felt satisfied, because he had been there before and knew there was nothing to be afraid of. But then, somewhere in the maze of rotting rooms, they got separated, and Sary stopped answering him. He called and called. He heard a loud crash somewhere in the house. He ran from room to room, his heart hammering, his imagination filling every shadow with something terrible. He was sure she was hurt. He was sure something had gone wrong. He was so scared that he started to cry. And then he panicked completely and bolted out into the pouring rain, sobbing all the way home, soaked to the bone. And when he burst into the kitchen to tell everyone he had lost Sary, there she was, sitting calmly at the table, dry and comfortable, eating a large slice of chocolate cake, a smug smile on her face, now moving through the low, narrow tunnel of the pyramid with his flashlight, aimed straight ahead. Gabe told himself the same thing was happening again. She was hiding somewhere, waiting to watch him fall apart. But anger is a fragile shield, and it did not last long. The questions started coming, quiet and relentless. What if she was not playing a trick? What if she had missed a step and fallen into a hole? What if she had gotten herself trapped in some hidden passage? He was half walking and half jogging now, his sneakers thudding against the sandy floor, calling her name with a desperation he no longer bothered to hide. There was no sign of her light ahead of him. There was no place to hide in a tunnel this narrow. He checked himself, wondering if he had somehow taken a wrong turn. But no, he had followed the same tunnel he had watched her disappear into. He stopped himself. He did not want to use that word, disappear. Then the tunnel ended. A small opening led into a square room. Gabe swept his flashlight from side to side. No Sari. The walls were bare. The air was warm and stale. He searched the floor for her footprints, but it was harder and less sandy here, and there was nothing to see. Then the light settled on something against the far wall, and Gabe felt his heart slam against his ribs. It was a mummy case, a large stone mummy case, at least 8 feet long, with curved corners and a carved lid. He stepped closer, and the light revealed a face carved into the stone. The face of a woman, wide-eyed and staring up at the ceiling, like a death mask. It must have been brilliantly painted once, but the centuries had drained it of color, and now it was grey and pale as ash. Gabe stood there wondering if Uncle Ben had ever seen this room, or if somehow he had stumbled onto a discovery all his own. He was building up the courage to reach out and touch the smooth stone lid when he heard it. A creaking sound, and the lid began to move. He froze. He told himself he had imagined it, but the lid lifted again, just a little more, and then came a hissing sound from inside the coffin, like air rushing out of a sealed container when it is opened for the first time in a very long time. Gabe stepped back. The lid rose another inch. He stepped back again and dropped his flashlight. He snatched it up with a trembling hand and forced himself to keep the beam on the case. The lid was now open nearly a foot. He pulled in a deep breath and held it. He wanted to run, but his fear had turned his legs to stone. He wanted to scream, but he could not make a sound. Inch by inch, the lid continued to rise. Gabe lowered the light to the dark opening. His hand shaking so badly, the beam danced and quivered, and from deep inside the ancient coffin, from somewhere in that lightless, sealed darkness, 2 eyes stared back at him. Gabe's heart nearly stopped the moment. Those cold, ancient eyes stared out at him from the darkness of the mummy case. A chill zigzagged down his spine, his mouth dropped open, and before he could stop himself, he was screaming at the top of his lungs, screaming until the sound bounced off the stone walls of that tiny buried room. And then the lid slid all the way open, and out climbed Sari, wearing the biggest, most triumphant grin he had ever seen on a human face. She laughed until she could barely breathe, loud and scornful, the kind of laughter designed to wound. Gabe stood there, chest still heaving, fists clenched at his sides, furious in a way that went bone deep. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out the little mummy hand he always carried, rolling it between his fingers the way he always did when he needed to calm down. It didn't help this time, not even a little. He scanned the floor desperately for something to throw at her, but there was nothing, not even a pebble. Sari reminded him that she had told him about the empty mummy case the day before. Did he not remember? That only made it worse. He had fallen for her father's mummy costume the day before, and now this, standing there, staring at her glowing, gleeful eyes. Gabe made a silent and iron promise to himself. He would pay her back, if it was the last thing he ever did. Before he could begin plotting his revenge, footsteps echoed down the tunnel. Uncle Ben burst into the room, and even in the dim light, Gabe could see the anger carved into his face. Uncle Ben spoke through gritted teeth, telling them both that he had trusted them, that hundreds of tunnels, maybe thousands, ran through that pyramid, many never explored, dangers unknown, and that he had turned around to find them simply gone. Sari tried to explain, but her father cut her off each time. In the end, Gabe and Sari both said sorry at the same moment, and Uncle Ben told them the pyramid visit was over for the day. Walking back through the tunnel, Gabe felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had screamed like a frightened child. He had made his favorite uncle furious, and now Sari was walking ahead with her arm linked through her father's, whispering something close to his ear. Then they both burst out laughing and turned to look at Gabe, and he felt his face go hot. He knew exactly what she had told him. He called out, "Merry Christmas to you too," and that only made them laugh harder. Back at the Cairo hotel that night, Gabe beat Sari in 2 straight games of Scrabble, though she complained the whole time that she had only vowels and the games were unfair. It did not make him feel better. Nothing did. The next morning, over a breakfast of pancakes that tasted like cowhide and frosted flakes in a box covered with Arabic writing, with Tony the tiger speaking in Arabic on the side, Uncle Ben told them he had a meeting at the Cairo Museum, just 2 blocks away, and that they might like to wander the exhibits while he went. Sari was less than thrilled. Uncle Ben mentioned the mummy collection to Gabe, trying to sweeten the deal. Sari noted dryly that at least these mummies probably would not climb out of their cases. Gabe stuck his tongue out at her. She flicked a wet frosted flake across the table at him. Then the phone rang. Uncle Ben's face shifted into something worried as he listened. 2 of his workers had fallen mysteriously ill overnight and were now in a hospital in Cairo. He needed to go to them right away. He told Gabe and Sari to stay in the room, or at least in the lobby, and promised he would be back within an hour. Then he pulled on his tan safari jacket, checked for his wallet and keys, and was gone. The 2 of them sat staring at each other in the sudden quiet. The room felt hot, stuffy, and small. Sari stood up and declared they needed to get out, and not just to the lobby. Gabe braced himself. The old Gabe would have worried and wavered, but the old Gabe had screamed in front of a mummy case while Sari laughed at him, and that Gabe was finished. He suggested the museum. He even offered to leave Uncle Ben a note, so he would know where they had gone. Sari tried her usual trick, asking if he was afraid, dangling the bait right in front of him. He did not bite. He wrote the note, calm and steady, and she followed him to the elevator. Down in the lobby, a young woman at the front desk told them to turn right outside the hotel and walk 2 blocks. They stepped out into the blazing Cairo sunshine, the light so sharp it felt like it had weight. Sari paused on the sidewalk and asked, one more time, if he was sure he was up for this. Gabe looked at her and said the words that would hang over everything that came next. What could go wrong? Gabe and Sari stepped out into the blazing Egyptian sun, squinting against the heat and noise as they made their way through the crowded, chaotic streets of Cairo. Car horns blared without mercy, and the sidewalks pressed in around them with a crush of people, unlike anything either of them had ever seen back home. Men in crisp business suits walked shoulder to shoulder with men in loose white clothing. Women in bright American fashions passed alongside women, draped head to toe in flowing black veils. It was a collision of worlds, and Gabe could hardly take it all in fast enough. They found the museum almost by accident, its tall stone facade rising up behind a steep flight of steps. The moment they pushed through the revolving doors, the chaos of the street fell away completely, replaced by a deep and welcome quiet. Gabe whispered out of instinct. The lobby was enormous, with marble staircases sweeping up on either side, and tall white columns framing a wide doorway ahead. A massive mural stretched across the right wall, showing an aerial view of the pyramids and the Nile, and both cousins stood there for a moment, simply staring. After getting directions from a friendly woman at the information desk, they climbed the staircase to the right, which felt like it went on forever. Sari raced ahead and won easily, but she barely paused to gloat. Something else had caught her attention. Ahead of them stretched a dark, high-ceilinged room that seemed to go on without end, filled with stone statues, towering mummy cases, displays of ancient glass and pottery, and case after case of relics from a civilization thousands of years old. Gabe was in heaven. He rushed to the first display case with pure excitement, and Sari stopped short to gawk at an enormous statue along the wall, a creature with a fierce dog's head and a lion's body, its ancient eyes fixed forward. as if daring anyone to come closer. Gabe explained that such creatures were placed outside tombs to frighten away grave robbers, and Sari leaned in for a closer look, briefly impressed. Then Gabe found the mummy. It lay inside an ancient stone coffin, wrapped tightly in yellowed linen, its skinny crossed arms resting over its chest. Sari was unimpressed at first. She had seen plenty of mummies, but Gabe had something better than a mummy. He had information, specifically the kind of gruesome stomach, turning information that he had been quietly storing up, waiting for exactly the right moment to use. He began with the brain. He described in loving detail how embalmers used a long, hooked tool pushed up through the nose to turn the brain into mush, and then used a long spoon to scoop it out, bit by bit, scoop by scoop, sometimes through the nose, sometimes through the eye socket. He watched Sari's face with great satisfaction as the color drained right out of it. She went green. She told him to stop. He did not stop. He moved on to decapitation, explaining how sometimes the head was simply removed, so the brain could drain out through the neck before being bandaged back onto the body. Sari looked like she was about to be sick. Her voice sounded strange, distant, as if it were coming from underwater. Gabe had never in his life seen Sari squeamish, and he was absolutely delighted. He filed this technique away for future use and pressed on, asking brightly if she wanted to know what they did with the guts. But the startled look on her face had nothing to do with him anymore. She was staring over his shoulder. Gabe turned around. Ahmed had entered the room, the same Ahmed from down inside the pyramid. The silent, friendly Egyptian man with the black ponytail, wearing his loose white trousers and shirt and the scarlet bandana around his neck. His expression had not warmed since the last time they saw him. If anything, it was harder now, angrier. His eyes moved from Gabe to Sari and back again, and he took a step forward. Sari grabbed Gabe's arm. Her hand was ice cold. She said they needed to run. Gabe hesitated for just a moment, wondering if they should at least say hello. But the look on Ahmed's face answered that question quickly enough. They turned and walked fast, then faster, and then they were both running at full speed through the vast chamber. Their sneakers hammered against the polished marble floor as they swerved around a glass case, holding 3 upright mummy cases, and then sprinted down the wide aisle between ancient sculptures and shelves of relics. Behind them, Ahmed's voice rang out, furious and sharp. "Come back," he shouted. "Come back." His shoes clacked and echoed through the empty hall as he ran, and Gabe could hear him gaining. They ran until there was nowhere left to run. A solid granite wall rose up in front of them. No doorway, no exit, just stone. They spun around and found Ahmed closing the distance, his eyes wide now with something that looked very much like triumph. He had them cornered, backed against the wall with no way out, and no idea why he was chasing them at all. Ahmed stopped just a few feet in front of them, panting hard, gasping for air, one hand pressed against his side like he had a cramp. He glared at them with angry dark eyes. Sari glanced at Gabe. She looked pale, really frightened. They both had their backs pressed flat against the wall, hearts hammering, waiting to see what this man was going to do. Gabe swallowed hard. His throat felt tight and dry. Then Ahmed finally managed to speak. "Why did you run?" he demanded, still clutching his side. "Why?" Neither of them answered. They just stared back at him, bracing themselves. He told them he had come with a message from Sari's father. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the red bandana from around his neck, and looked at them like he genuinely could not understand what had just happened. And just like that, the terror drained right out of them, replaced by something almost worse. Embarrassment, pure, burning embarrassment. Sari stammered an apology. Gabe jumped in too, and soon they were both babbling at once, each one nudging the blame toward the other. Sari jabbed Gabe in the ribs with her elbow, and said it was his fault, that he had filled her head with frightening mummy stories. Gabe said he had just been startled when Sari ran. They were tripping over each other's words, desperate to explain themselves to a man who had simply been trying to deliver a message. Ahmed told them that Sari's father had returned to the hotel, found Gabe's note, and sent Ahmed to collect them. He had not expected to chase them through an entire museum to do it. They followed him out in silence, walking side by side a few steps behind him, sneaking guilty looks at each other as they descended the long stairway. They felt like complete jerks. There was no other word for it. Back out on the street, the city roared around them. Cars honked in an endless, impatient chorus. Drivers leaned out of windows, shouting and shaking their fists. The sun sat high and hot above the buildings, and the air was thick and humid and close. Then Gabe noticed something was wrong. Ahmed had turned right, leading them away from the hotel. Gabe called out and pointed back the way they had come. The hotel was that way. He was sure of it. Ahmed said his car was just up ahead, and that it was no trouble to drive them. Gabe tried to argue. The hotel was only 2 blocks away. They could walk it themselves, but Ahmed placed one firm hand on Gabe's shoulder and one on Sari's, and guided them forward without a word of debate. They crossed the street. The sidewalk grew even more crowded. A man's swinging briefcase clipped Gabe hard on the shoulder. Sari laughed. Gabe muttered at her. They kept walking. Ahmed's car turned out to be a small, dusty, 4-door station wagon with a crunched fender on the driver's side. They piled into the back seat and immediately regretted it. The leather burned right through their clothes. Ahmed touched the steering wheel like it was a hot stove, trying to get used to the heat as he buckled his seat belt. The engine caught on the second try. He pulled into traffic and started honking immediately, nudging the car forward in slow, stop and start lurches through the narrow street. Sari wondered aloud why her father hadn't come himself. Ahmed answered simply that he was waiting at the hotel. Then Ahmed made a sharp turn onto a wider avenue and began to pick up speed. Gabe had a gift for direction. His parents always said they never needed a map when he was around. And right now, every instinct he had was screaming the same thing. They were heading the wrong way. He said so, politely at first, just pointing it out. Ahmed told him he was mistaken and kept driving. Gabe insisted. The hotel was behind them now. He was sure of it. He could see it in the way the buildings were changing outside the window, getting lower and more rundown, the downtown skyline shrinking away in the distance. Settle back and enjoy the ride, Ahmed said. He suggested they fasten their seatbelts right now. His face carried a smile. His voice did not. That smile. That cold, flat voice. Those words that sounded less like friendly advice and more like a warning. Gabe felt the fear crawl back in, slower this time, but heavier. Sari reached over and caught Gabe's eye. Her face had gone tight with worry. She had heard it too. They both had. Ahmed was not taking them to the hotel. He was taking them out of the city entirely. The friendly man with the message, the man who had simply been trying to help, had just become something else entirely. Gabe and Sari were being kidnapped. Gabe and Sari were trapped in the back of Ahmed's car, and they both knew it. The rear-view mirror kept catching Ahmed's eyes as they flicked back to watch them, and Gabe knew there was only one way out. He leaned close to Sari and whispered 3 quiet words into her ear. Next time he stops. Sari didn't understand at first, but then she did, and the two of them sat rigid in their seats, hearts hammering, hands inching toward the door handles, waiting for their moment. Ahmed broke the silence with a chilling observation. "Your father is a very smart man," he said, his gaze finding Sari in the mirror. "I know," Sari replied in the smallest voice she had. Then the traffic slowed. Then it stopped. Now. Gabe screamed. Both of them lunged for the door handles at the same moment. Gabe threw his open and hurled himself out into the street. Car horns erupted all around him in an angry chorus, and he could hear Ahmed's startled shout cutting through the noise. He spun around just in time to see Sari hit the pavement too, slamming her door shut behind her, her eyes blown wide with fear. They didn't say a word. They just ran. The honking faded behind them as they plunged into a narrow side street, brick paving curving between tall white stucco buildings that pressed in on either side. Gabe felt like a rat in a maze, the walls close and the path uncertain. Then the alley opened up into a wide circle, and suddenly there was a small outdoor market around them, fruit and vegetable stands clustered together, a handful of shoppers moving between them. "Is he following us?" Sari called out, a few steps behind him now. Gabe turned and searched the crowd with darting eyes. He saw people in flowing white robes, 2 women in black carrying a basket heaped high with bananas, a boy on a bicycle swerving hard to avoid them. "I don't see him," Gabe called back, but they kept running anyway, because fear has its own momentum. Gabe had never been so scared in his life. He begged silently with every pounding step, pleading that Ahmed was not behind them, pleading that he would not catch them. They turned a corner and burst out onto a wide, busy avenue. A truck rumbled past, pulling a trailer full of horses. The sidewalk was thick with shoppers and business people. Gabe and Sari pushed into the crowd, trying to disappear inside it. At last, near the entrance of what looked like a large department store, they stopped. Gabe bent forward with his hands on his knees, gasping, trying to pull his breath back. "We've lost him," Sari said, her gaze sweeping back the way they had come. "Yeah, we're okay," Gabe said, and he meant it. He smiled at her. She did not smile back. Her face was still tight with fear. Her eyes kept moving through the crowd. One hand pulled nervously at a strand of her hair. "We're okay," Gabe said again. "We got away." "There is only one problem," she said quietly. "Problem. Now we're lost," she replied, finally turning to face him. "We're lost, Gabe. We don't know where we are." That was the moment the heavy feeling settled into Gabe's stomach. He almost let out a frightened cry. Almost. But he stopped himself. He held it in. He thought about how things had always been between them. Sari was always the brave one, the winner, the champ. And he was always the one who flinched. But right now, looking at her face, he could see that she was the scared one. And that meant something. This was his moment. "No problem," he told her, looking up at the glass and concrete towers around them. "We'll just ask somebody to direct us to the hotel." "But no one speaks English," she cried, and her voice was right on the edge. No problem," he said, a shade less convincingly. "I am sure someone. We're lost," she said again, miserable, shaking her head. "Totally lost." And then Gabe saw it, sitting right there at the curb, a taxi empty and waiting. "Come on," he said, grabbing her arm. He pulled her over, and they climbed into the back seat together. The driver, a thin young man with a wide black mustache and stringy black hair escaping from a small grey cap, turned around in surprise. "The Cairo Center Hotel," Gabe said, glancing at Sari with what he hoped looked like reassurance. The driver stared back at him with a completely blank expression. "Please take us to the Cairo Center Hotel," Gabe repeated, slow and clear. The driver tilted his head back, opened his mouth wide, and started to laugh. The moment the taxi driver burst into laughter, Sari's grip tightened around Gabe's wrist like a vice. She was convinced they had walked straight into one of Ahmed's traps. Gabe's heart lurched with a cold stab of fear, and he yanked the door handle, ready to bolt into the Cairo streets. But then the driver raised a hand, and through his tears of laughter, pointed straight through the windshield. There was the Cairo Center Hotel, sitting right across the street. The whole terrifying ride had been nothing more than a misunderstanding, and the driver had found it absolutely hilarious. Sari managed a wide, relieved smile as they scrambled out onto the pavement. Gabe was less amused. The cab driver's sense of humor felt a little too strange for his taste. Still, they were safe, and that was what mattered. But the relief was short-lived. When they rushed upstairs to their hotel room, they found it empty. Gabe's note sat right where he had left it, untouched. Not a single thing had been moved. Uncle Ben had never returned. Ahmed had lied about everything, just as they had suspected. Gabe flopped onto the couch with a heavy sigh, trying to make sense of it all. Then the door flew open without warning, and both of them screamed. It was Uncle Ben, and Gabe could not begin to describe how glad he was to see his uncle's familiar face rather than Ahmed's. But something was wrong. Uncle Ben moved through the room with a dazed, hollow look in his eyes, like a man who had just witnessed something he could not explain. His two workers, he told them, were in a state of shock, completely speechless. The doctors had no real explanation. Something or someone had terrified them inside the pyramid, and now they could not speak a word. Before Uncle Ben could say anything more, Sari grabbed his hand and blurted out the whole story. Ahmed, the museum, the car ride in the wrong direction, the desperate escape into traffic. Uncle Ben kept repeating the man's name as if he simply could not make the pieces fit together. Ahmed had come to him with excellent credentials and references. He was a cryptographer, a scholar of ancient Egyptian wall writings and symbols. So why had he tried to take the children, and where had he planned to bring them? Uncle Ben said he intended to find out. He was going to the pyramid, and he told them firmly that they would stay at the hotel with room service. Sari erupted immediately. She was not staying behind, not with Ahmed possibly still out there somewhere. Gabe agreed completely, and after a moment of staring out at the clouds rolling dark across the Cairo sky, Uncle Ben gave in. They were coming with him, but he made himself very clear. They were to stick close, follow instructions, and there would be no wandering off and absolutely no more practical jokes. Gabe noticed something in that moment. His uncle, the man who was famous in the family for his jolly pranks and easy laughter, was gone. In his place stood a scientist who was genuinely frightened, and that frightened Gabe more than almost anything else that had happened. After sandwiches in the hotel restaurant, the three of them drove out through the desert. Heavy clouds swallowed the sun and cast the sand in deep, shimmering shades of blue and grey. The pyramid rose on the horizon like a slow looming threat, growing larger with every mile of highway they covered. Gabe remembered the awe he had felt the first time he saw it. Now he felt only dread. Uncle Ben parked near the hidden entrance at the back of the pyramid. The wind was picking up, throwing sand in curling spirals around their legs. Before they stepped inside, he handed each of them a beeper clipped to their belts, a small homing device that would send electronic signals to the unit he was wearing if either of them pressed the button. He handed them flashlights and gave clear, sharp instructions about keeping the light aimed at the floor ahead of them. Sari reminded him they had done this before, and he cut her off with a firm reminder to just follow instructions. This was not a game anymore. Gabe pulled out his little mummy hand before entering, checking that his good luck charm was still in his pocket. Sari groaned at the sight of it and gave him a playful shove into the tunnel entrance. A few moments later they were descending the rope ladder and pushing into the first narrow passage. Uncle Ben led the way, his flashlight sweeping back and forth across the floor. Sari followed a few steps behind him, and Gabe walked a few steps behind her. The tunnel felt narrower and lower than he remembered, though he figured that was probably just his nerves. Then his sneaker came untied. Gabe stopped, set his flashlight down, and crouched to fix it. Uncle Ben and Sari had gotten into some kind of argument and were walking ahead, their voices bouncing and echoing off the stone walls, too garbled for Gabe to make out. He called after them to wait up. They did not hear him. He double-knotted the lace, grabbed his flashlight, and stood. The echoing voices were gone. The tunnel was silent. He shouted again. No answer came back. Once again, deep inside the pyramid, Gabe was alone. Gabe was alone in the dark, and he knew it. He swept his flashlight beam across the ancient tunnel floor and broke into a jog, following the passage as it curved sharply to the right. The air was growing hotter, thick with a musty heaviness that made breathing feel like work. The floor sloped upward beneath his feet, and still there was no sign of Uncle Ben or Sari. He called out their names. His voice disappeared into the tunnel and gave him nothing back He stopped, listened, silence, and then, creeping in at the edges of his fear, came a thought that was almost a relief. What if this was another practical joke? What if Uncle Ben and Sari were crouched inside mummy cases right now, stifling their laughter, waiting for him to stumble past? Uncle Ben had never been able to resist a good prank. He had laughed like a hyena when Sari described how she had hidden in that mummy case and terrified Gabe half to death. Was this more of the same? Gabe stood there in the sweltering dark, his heart thudding against his ribs, and slowly talked himself out of it. Number, not today. Uncle Ben had been too serious, too tight with worry about his stricken workers, too troubled by what they had told him about Ahmed. Whatever was happening, it was not a joke. Gabe moved on. His hand brushed the beeper, clipped to his waist, as he jogged through the narrowing passage. He thought about pressing it. He decided against it. He could already hear Sari's voice in his head, sharp with delight, telling everyone how he had begged for rescue after barely 2 minutes inside the pyramid. The walls pressed closer. The granite was lined with jagged cracks that ran down from the ceiling like dark lightning bolts. The floor grew harder beneath his feet, the sand giving way to solid stone. Then the tunnel split, branching off in 2 directions, and Gabe stopped cold. He shined the light into the left tunnel and called out. Nothing. He backed out and tried the right. This one was wider, curving gently, promising something without delivering it. A maze of tunnels. Uncle Ben had called the pyramid. Maybe thousands of them. The word thousand sat heavy in Gabe's chest as he pushed himself forward, telling himself they had to be just around the next curve. They had to be. Then he heard something. Not voices. Not anything human. A soft chattering, a small insect clicking, maybe a rat skittering somewhere in the walls. He froze, straining his ears against the silence. The sound came again. He decided to forget about his pride. He reached for the beeper. Sari could laugh all she wanted. He would take the teasing. He just needed them to come and get him. But before his hand could find the device, the sound beneath him changed. The insect chittering dropped away and became something else. A soft cracking, delicate at first, like someone snapping a thin cracker in 2. Then louder still. It rose up from the floor, spread to the walls, seemed to come from everywhere at once. Gabe lowered his light to his feet and stared down at his shoes. By the time his brain caught up with what was happening, there was nothing he could do. The ancient tunnel floor buckled and split apart beneath him. He felt himself pulled downward, as though something vast and hungry had opened its mouth below him. The stone gave way in a rush, and Gabe dropped into nothing. He reached out with both hands and grabbed only empty air. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound never came. Down he fell, down and down into the swirling, absolute blackness below, with no bottom in sight and no one who knew where he was. The fall was sudden, brutal and total. One moment there was the metallic clang of a flashlight hitting concrete, and the next the protagonist crashed down hard onto their side. Pain exploded through the body in a flash of bright red, so blinding and overwhelming that consciousness itself gave way, swept under like a candle in a storm. When the eyes opened again, the world was a murky grey-yellow blur. The side ached deeply, and the right elbow throbbed with its own insistent agony. But the elbow moved, at least, carefully, slowly. The figure sat up, and the haze began to lift like a curtain climbing toward the rafters of some old and forgotten theatre. The air was wrong. That was the first clear sensation. A sour, creeping smell filled the nostrils. The smell of decay, of ancient dust, of something long dead and undisturbed. Wherever this place was, it had not known the living for a very long time. The flashlight had survived the fall, lying nearby on the cold concrete floor, its beam still cutting through the dark. The protagonists followed that beam with their eyes, tracing it toward the far wall, and then the breath stopped. The light had found a hand, a human hand, or something shaped like one. The hand connected to an arm, and the arm hung stiffly from a body standing upright near the wall, still and silent as a held secret. With trembling fingers, the flashlight was raised and steadied, and the full shape of the figure came into focus. It was a mummy standing on its own 2 feet, wrapped in aged bandages, eyeless and mouthless, and yet that featureless face seemed to stare back with an unbearable tension, as though it had been waiting there for a very long time, patient and ready, waiting for whoever dared to make the first move. There are moments when fear roots a person to the spot, when the body simply refuses to obey, and this was one of those moments for Gabe. His flashlight darted wildly across a featureless face staring back at him from the darkness, and his hand shook so badly he could barely hold the beam steady. His whole body was trembling. He was panting, loud and ragged, the sound of his own breath almost as frightening as whatever stood before him. It was a mummy. Gabe forced himself to drag in a deep breath of the foul, ancient air, holding it until the panic in his chest settled just enough for him to think. The mummy did not move. It simply stood there, arms hanging stiffly at its sides, as though it had been waiting in that exact position for a very long time. That small fact that it was not lurching toward him allowed Gabe to exhale slowly and find his voice. "Easy, Gabe, easy," he said out loud, willing the flashlight to stop shaking in his grip. Groaning from the pain in his side where he had landed hard on the floor, he climbed to his feet and swept the beam back and forth across the darkness beyond the silent figure. What he found stopped him cold, and a low, breathless sound escaped his lips. He was standing in the middle of an enormous chamber, far bigger than the one where Uncle Ben and his workers had been digging, and it was not empty. Not even close to empty. The chamber was absolutely crammed with mummies, dozens of them, their bandaged shadows reaching toward him in the unsteady light. Some leaned against the walls. Some lay on stone slabs with their arms folded across their chests. Others were crouched at strange angles, or stood with their arms stretched straight out in front of them. And in the flickering glow they looked like something out of a nightmare. Against one wall stood a row of open mummy cases, their lids propped back as though someone had left them in a hurry. Gabe turned slowly, following the arc of his flashlight, and realized he had fallen into the very center of the room. Behind him he could make out an astonishing collection of equipment, strange prong, like tools he had never seen before, towering stacks of cloth, enormous clay pots and jars, standing like silent sentinels in the dark. He told himself to breathe, to go slowly, and he moved toward the stacks of cloth. Linen, almost certainly, the material used for wrapping the dead. He forced himself to examine the tools nearby, not touching anything, just letting his light move over them. Mummy making tools. Ancient mummy making tools, thousands of years old. Then his light crossed the floor and landed on something that made him drift forward despite himself. Near the center of the chamber was a large dark square on the floor, almost the size of a swimming pool. He stepped carefully around 2 mummies lying on their backs and crouched down at its edge to get a closer look. The surface was soft and sticky like tar. He pulled his hand back quickly, and then a chill moved through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. How could the tar still be soft after 4,000 years? How was everything in this chamber preserved so perfectly? The tools, the linen, the mummies themselves, all of it kept as though time had simply never reached this place. And why were so many mummies, at least 24 of them, left out in the open like this, scattered in such strange positions, rather than sealed in their cases? The answer to all of those questions swirled in his mind as the sour, ancient smell hit him again, flooding his nose with the unmistakable odor of 4,000-year-old bodies. It was a smell that had been sealed inside this hidden room until his fall had cracked it open. He pressed the back of his hand to his face and forced himself not to gag. He had made an incredible discovery. By falling through the floor, he had stumbled into a hidden chamber, a place where mummies had been prepared, complete with every tool and every material the ancient Egyptians had used. It was extraordinary, but it was also very, very dark, and he was very, very alone. And the faceless figures surrounding him were not making that any easier to bear. His hand went to his belt for the beeper. Uncle Ben and Sari would come running the moment he pressed the button. All he had to do was press it, and he would not have to stand alone in this chamber a moment longer. He lifted the small device into the light. Then he cried out. The beeper was destroyed, smashed completely, the button sunken and useless. He must have landed directly on it when he fell through the floor. He pressed it again and again, but nothing happened. Nothing would ever happen. Gabe stood alone in the ancient dark, gripping the wrecked beeper in one fist, and the trembling flashlight in the other, surrounded on all sides by silent, faceless figures that had been waiting in that chamber for 4,000 years, and no one in the world knew he was there. He was alone, completely, terribly alone. The boy stared in horror at the worthless beeper in his hand. The flashlight trembled as he gripped it. Suddenly, everything seemed to close in around him. The walls, the ceiling, the darkness, the mummies. He stumbled back a step, then another, realizing he was clutching the flashlight so tightly that his hand ached. The beam of light played over the faceless figures looming in the chamber. They weren't moving. Of course they weren't moving. He took another step back. The sour, rotten odor seemed to grow stronger, thicker. He held his breath, but the smell was already in his nostrils, in his mouth. He could taste it, taste the decay, taste the 4,000-year-old aroma of death soaking into the air around him. He tossed the useless beeper onto the floor and kept backing away, eyes locked on the hovering mummies. He had to get out of there. He had to find Uncle Ben. Help! He tried to shout, but his voice came out weak and muffled, swallowed by the heavy foul air. Help! Can anybody hear me? A little louder this time. He tucked the flashlight under his arm and cupped both hands around his mouth like a megaphone. Can anybody hear me? He screamed. He listened, desperate for any reply at all. Silence. Where were Sari and Uncle Ben? Why couldn't they hear him? Why weren't they looking for him? Help, somebody, please help. He screamed as loud as his lungs would let him, tilting his head up toward the hole in the ceiling, the hole he had fallen through. Can't anybody hear me? He shrieked. He could feel the panic grip his chest, freeze his legs. It swept over him in wave after paralyzing wave. Help me, somebody, please. He took another step back, and something crunched beneath his sneaker. He let out a high-pitched yelp and stumbled forward. Whatever it was slithered away. He exhaled loudly, a long shaking breath of relief, and then something brushed against his ankle. He cried out, and the flashlight slipped from under his arm. It clattered noisily to the floor. The light went out. Again, something scraped silently against him, something hard. He heard soft, scrabbling sounds down near the floor. Something snapped at his ankle. He kicked hard but hit only air. Oh, help! There were creatures down there, a lot of them. But what were they? Something slapped at his ankle again, and he kicked wildly. Frantically, he bent down, groping for the flashlight in the darkness. His fingers closed around something hard and warm. Oh, no! He jerked his hand back with a startled cry. In the darkness, groping blindly, he had the terrifying feeling that the entire floor had come to life, that it was moving in waves, rolling and tossing and seething beneath him. Finally, his fingers found the flashlight. He grabbed it up in his trembling hand, climbed to his feet, and struggled to switch it back on. As he stepped backward, something slid against his leg. It felt hard and prickly. He heard clicking sounds, snapping, creatures bumping into each other. Panting loudly, his chest heaving, his entire body gripped with terror. He jumped up and tried to dance away while he fumbled with the flashlight switch. Something crunched loudly beneath his sneaker. He hopped over something that scuttled right between his legs. Finally, the light flickered on, his heart thudding. He lowered the yellow beam to the floor and saw the scrabbling, snapping creatures, scorpions. He had stumbled into a disgusting nest of them. Oh, help! He didn't even recognize his own tiny, frightened voice as he cried out. The light darted over the slithering creatures, their tails raised as if ready to strike, their claws snapping silently as they moved. They crawled over each other, slithering past his ankles without mercy. "Somebody help!" He leapt backward as a pair of claws grabbed at the leg of his jeans, and he landed right next to another creature whose tail snapped against the back of his sneaker, struggling to escape the poisonous mass of bodies he tripped. No, please, no. He couldn't save himself. He started to fall. His hand shot out, but found nothing to grab. He was going to plunge right into the middle of them. No! He let out a frantic cry as he toppled forward, and then two hands grabbed him firmly by the shoulders from behind. For one terrible moment, Gabe was certain he was done for. The scorpions snapped and scrabbled at his feet, and a pair of strong hands had seized him by the shoulders. His whole body convulsed with fear. He was convinced, in that awful instant, that the ancient bandaged hands of a mummy had come to claim him. He spun around, breathless and shaking, and found himself staring into a face he knew. It was Sari. She gave him one final hard tug, and the two of them stumbled backwards together, away from the writhing nest of scorpions, and into the safety of the vast chamber's center. Gabe could still feel the hideous creatures sliding along his ankles, still hear that awful crunching sound beneath his sneakers. He did not think he would ever forget it. Sari never one to waste a moment of drama. Immediately launched into a scolding. She demanded to know what he was doing down there alone. Telling him that she and her father had been searching everywhere for him, Gabe could not decide whether he was more grateful or annoyed. He felt both at once, which was a very Sari kind of feeling to produce in a person. She explained how she had come to find him. She and Uncle Ben had gotten separated when he stopped to speak with a worker. She had not noticed until she turned back and found herself alone. Then she had spotted Gabe's flashlight moving around inside the chamber, and assumed it was her father. Gabe pointed out with some heat that he had called out to them, and they had simply disappeared. Sari admitted they had been so caught up in their argument that they never heard him, and that by the time they turned around he was gone. She sighed and shook her head. "What a day," she said. "What a day." Gabe could barely believe the understatement, but then he remembered what he had to show her, and the anger began to loosen its grip. He swept his flashlight across the chamber, from the crouching mummy near the tar pit to the one lying down to the long row of mummy cases pressed against the wall. He watched Sari's eyes go wide. She mouthed a single silent word. "Wow, yeah," Gabe agreed. "Wow," he told her everything, his voice climbing with excitement. The chamber was packed with mummies. There were tools and folded cloth, and every instrument needed to prepare a body for burial, all of it in perfect condition, as though no living soul had laid eyes on it in thousands of years. And he had found it all. He had discovered it. He could not help saying that part out loud. Sari, being Sari, immediately pointed out that she had also saved his life, so the credit was at least partly hers. But even she could not pretend not to be amazed. She moved through the chamber, studying the neatly stacked linen, peering at the upright mummies, and wondering aloud why some of them were standing. "This must have been where the bodies were prepared for burial," she said, and the question of those standing figures hung unanswered in the dusty air. "You are going to be famous," she told him, with a genuine smile breaking across her face. Gabe told her they needed to call Uncle Ben immediately. He kept glancing back at the scorpion nest, a chill tightening the back of his neck. Sari had drifted close to one of the upright mummies and was holding her flashlight near its wrapped face, remarking that people must have been very small back then, because she was actually taller than it. Then she noticed something moving in the wrappings, bugs crawling in its face. She stepped back fast and made a sound of pure disgust. Gabe reached for the beeper on her belt, but she pulled away. She asked why he had not used his own, and then, reading his expression perfectly, accused him of forgetting he even had it. He told her sharply that his had broken when he fell into the chamber. She raised an eyebrow, pressed the button on her beeper twice to be sure, and clipped it back onto her jeans. They stood with their arms crossed and waited. Sari said it should not take long. Uncle Ben had not been far behind her in the tunnel, and sure enough, within seconds, they heard the sounds of someone moving through the dark passage. Gabe called out with excitement, telling Uncle Ben to come see what he had found. Both of them started running toward the tunnel entrance, their lights swinging back and forth. Sari called for her father. Then she stopped. The figure that leaned out of the darkness and straightened up was not Uncle Ben. The glow of their flashlights lit up a mustached face, and the blood seemed to drain right out of the room. It was Ahmed. The torchlight flickered against the ancient stone walls, and the two cousins found themselves face to face with the one person they had hoped never to see down here alone. Ahmed, the man who had already tried to kidnap them, the man who now stood between them and the only way out, a flaming torch raised high in one hand, his black hair glowing, his eyes narrowed with cold and terrible purpose. Sari gripped her cousin's arm so hard it hurt. She called out to Ahmed, demanding to know what he was doing there. His answer came back just as soft and just as chilling. He wanted to know what they were doing there. He stepped further into the chamber, his eyes sweeping the room as though checking that nothing had been disturbed. Sari warned him that her father was on his way, that she had already beeped him. Ahmed barely flinched. Instead, he said something that caught them both off guard. He told them he had tried to warn their father, tried to warn him about the curse. The curse. It was a word that hung in the hot underground air like smoke. Ahmed's face, lit by the orange and shifting glow of the torch, was not the face of a man making idle threats. It was the face of a man who believed deeply and completely in every word he was saying. When Sari's cousin mentioned that Uncle Ben hadn't taken the curse seriously, Ahmed snapped. He screamed it, his eyes blazing. He should have. The two of them stood in frightened silence. Where was Uncle Ben? Why wasn't he coming? Ahmed lowered his voice again, almost sad now, explaining that the curse had to be carried out. They had violated the priestess's chamber. This was the sacred preparation chamber of the priestess Kala, and by entering it they had sealed their fate. Sari tried to push back, snapping that they hadn't known, that they hadn't touched a single thing. Her cousin backed her up quickly. Ahmed's response was to swing the torch at them like a weapon and scream at them to shut up. Sari kept her eyes moving to the tunnel behind Ahmed, dark, silent. No sign of her father. She tried to stall, pushing Ahmed to keep talking, asking him about the warnings he had mentioned. He told them he had frightened the two workers on the dig, had given them what he called a little demonstration. He told them what it might feel like to be boiled alive. He glanced toward the tar pit as he said it. They didn't like it, he added quietly, and still Uncle Ben did not appear. Ahmed explained everything then, the words pouring out of him with the weight of a man reciting scripture. The priestess Kala had decreed, more than 4,000 years ago, that her chamber would never be violated. From generation to generation, descendants of Kala had kept that promise. The duty had passed down through time itself, and now it had come to him. He had volunteered to work for Uncle Ben in order to watch over the chamber. When the warnings failed, he had planned to take the children, to hold them until the dig was abandoned. But now, standing here, he said he had no choice. He had to carry out his sacred duty. What does that mean? Sari cried, her voice shaking in the torchlight. Ahmed told them to look around. They looked. They still didn't understand until he told them to look at the mummies. The mummies, he said calmly, were all violators of the priestess's chamber. A few of them were ancient intruders, yes, but some were quite recent, and every single one of them had been mummified alive. The words hit like a physical blow. Sari raised her hands to her face in horror. Ahmed pointed to one mummy standing stiffly at the edge of the tar pit and said, with a terrible kind of pride that he had done that one himself. Now it all made sense. The horrible, sickening sense of it clicked into place. The mummies in such perfect condition, the tools lying ready, the tar, the linen, all of it preserved and waiting. This chamber had never stopped being used. Generation after generation, the work had continued. Anyone who entered this room had been wrapped and sealed and left as a trophy to Carla. And now it was their turn. Ahmed announced it plainly. Today there would be new mummies, new trophies for Carla. Sari screamed that he couldn't. Her cousin grabbed her hand, understanding perfectly now, understanding in a way that turned his blood to ice. Ahmed only replied that it was the will of Carla. Then the dagger appeared, long-bladed, catching the torchlight in a cold gleam. Ahmed moved toward them with quick, deliberate strides, and they stumbled back as the chamber closed in around them, the tunnel still dark, still silent, and Uncle Ben nowhere in sight. As Ahmed closed in, the two children pressed themselves toward the center of the ancient chamber, hearts hammering, eyes darting in desperation. There was nowhere to run. The only way out was the tunnel in the corner, and reaching it meant running straight through Ahmed. Sari jabbed frantically at the beeper on her waist, her face tight with terror. Then the boy lurched backward into something solid and bandaged and cold, and let out a cry that echoed off the stone walls. A mummy. He spun away from it, nearly stumbling, and hissed to Sari that they should make a break for the tunnel. Ahmed couldn't catch both of them, but if Sari hurt him, she gave no sign. Ahmed spoke then, quietly, almost gently, as if he were commenting on the weather. There was no escape, he said, no escape from Carla's curse. He raised his torch and gripped the dagger at his hip, stepping closer. He told them he had seen everything. He had watched them climb into the sacred sarcophagus. He had watched them playing in Carla's holy chamber. And it was then, he said, that he knew he had to carry out his sacred duties. Before he could say another word, something came swinging down from above, a rope ladder, dropping through the hole in the ceiling, swaying and unspooling toward the chamber floor. A familiar voice boomed down from the darkness above. Uncle Ben was coming. The boy screamed for him to stay back, but it was too late. Uncle Ben was already moving down the ladder, quick and steady, and halfway to the floor, he stopped and peered into the chamber with wide, astonished eyes. Then he saw Ahmed, and his expression shifted from wonder to sharp disbelief. He dropped the last few rungs and landed on the stone floor. Ahmed told him he was merely carrying out Carla's wishes. Sari flew to her father, throwing her arms around his waist, sobbing that Ahmed was going to kill them, that he was going to turn them into mummies. Uncle Ben held her and looked over her shoulder at Ahmed, his voice steady and his eyes hard. He asked if it was true. Ahmed confirmed it without hesitation. The chamber had been violated. It had fallen to him to carry out the curse. Uncle Ben set Sari gently aside and began walking toward Ahmed. Slowly, calmly, he raised his open hand as if offering friendship and asked Ahmed to come outside with him to talk. Ahmed stepped back and lifted the torch as a warning. The priestess's will could not be ignored, but Uncle Ben kept walking. He reminded Ahmed that they were both scientists. His voice was so steady, so measured, that for a moment it almost felt like the tension in the room was unraveling. The boy breathed a little easier. Sari stared with teeth clenched around her lower lip, watching her father close the distance between himself and the man with the torch. Uncle Ben said that Carla had had her way for many centuries. Perhaps it was time to let it rest. He asked Ahmed to lower his weapons. Scientist to scientist, it was going to be all right. The boy could feel it. They were going to walk out of there alive. And then Ahmed moved. Without a word, without any warning at all, he pulled his arms back, gripped the torch handle with both hands, and swung it with full force at Uncle Ben's head. The crack of impact filled the chamber. The orange flame swirled upward in a wild, bright arc. Uncle Ben's eyes went wide with shock and pain. His knees buckled. He groaned once, And then he crumpled, going limp and silent on the chamber floor. Ahmed raised the torch high above him, his eyes blazing with triumph. And standing there in the flickering shadow of that ancient tomb, the boy understood with cold and terrible certainty that no one was coming to save them now. Sari reached her father first, dropping to her knees at his side, but Ahmed moved fast. He thrust the torch toward her and held the dagger ready, forcing her to scramble back. A thin trickle of blood, glowing darkly in the firelight, rolled down the side of Uncle Ben's face. He groaned but did not stir. The narrator glanced quickly at the mummies scattered around the room, and the terrible truth settled in. They would soon be among them. For a moment there was the wild thought of leaping at Ahmed, knocking him over, grabbing the torch and swinging it hard, forcing him against the wall. But the blade of the dagger caught the light like a warning, and reason cut through the desperation. This was a grown man armed with a knife and a torch. Fighting him was not bravery, it was madness, and the whole scene was madness. The stomach tightened. A wave of nausea rolled in and would not leave. Then Sari screamed at Ahmed to let them go, and to everyone's surprise Ahmed reacted by swinging the torch back and hurling it across the room. It landed with a soft plop in the center of the tar pit. The surface of the tar burst into flames instantly. The fire spread and leaped upward toward the chamber ceiling until the entire square was ablaze, the tar popping and bubbling beneath a covering of orange and red. "We must wait for it to boil," Ahmed said, completely calm, the shadows from the flames flickering across his face. The chamber filled with thick smoke. Both children began to cough. Ahmed bent down, slid his hands under Uncle Ben's shoulders, and began dragging him across the floor. Sari screamed at him to stop and ran toward Ahmed in a frenzy, ready to fight. She was grabbed by the shoulders and pulled back. There was no matching Ahmed. He had already knocked Uncle Ben unconscious, and there was no telling what he was willing to do next. With a strength that seemed impossible for one man, Ahmed hauled Uncle Ben across the floor to one of the open mummy cases against the wall. He hoisted him up over the side, shoved him in, and slid the lid closed over the unconscious man. He did all of this without even drawing a labored breath. Then he turned and pointed toward an enormous mummy case, resting on a tall pedestal beside Uncle Ben's. It was nearly as tall as the boy standing before it, and at least 10 feet long, built, it seemed, to hold not just a mummified body, but all of that person's earthly possessions. Sari begged. She told Ahmed they would tell no one, she promised. Her voice was raw and desperate, but Ahmed only smiled with patience and gestured toward the case, insisting they climb in and wait for the tar to be ready. "We're not going in there," came the reply, though the voice shook and the blood pounded hard at both temples. The words came out before there was even a conscious choice to speak them. Fear had taken over completely. Sari stood beside him with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, striking a pose of defiance. But her chin trembled, and her eyes had begun to fill with tears. Ahmed repeated the command. He said that Carla would not be kept waiting. He said the ancient curse would be carried out in her name. The boy stood on his toes and peered over the edge of the enormous case. The smell that rose from inside was so foul he nearly lost the contents of his stomach entirely. The wood was warped and stained and peeling, and in the flickering light he was almost certain he could see dozens of insects crawling along the inside walls. "Get into the case now," Ahmed demanded. "The chapter leaves them right there, teetering on the edge of that rotting coffin, with boiling tar waiting behind them and a madman's blade waiting in front. There is no way out that anyone can see." Sari went first, of course. She always had to be first at everything. But this was one time Gabe did not mind at all. He hesitated at the edge of the ancient mummy case, resting his hand on the rotting wood. His eyes drifted to the stone case beside it, the one with Uncle Ben sealed inside. The heavy stone lid was closed tight. Gabe felt a cold grip of fear squeeze his chest. Did Uncle Ben have any air in there? Was he even able to breathe? And then, with a sick and hollow feeling, Gabe thought, What difference does it make? All three of them were going to be dead soon. All three of them were going to be mummies, locked away in this hidden chamber forever. Ahmed's dark eyes burned into him. "Get in now," he ordered. "I am just a kid," Gabe cried. He did not even know where the words came from. He was so scared. He barely knew what he was saying. An unpleasant sneer spread across Ahmed's face. "Many of the pharaohs were your age at death," he said. Gabe wanted to keep him talking. He had the desperate idea that if he could just keep the conversation going, he might find some way out of this mess. But his brain froze solid. He could not think of a single thing to say. "Get in," Ahmed ordered, moving toward him. Feeling completely defeated, Gabe slid one leg over the side of the rotting coffin, raised himself up, and dropped down beside Sari. She had her head bowed and her eyes shut tight. He thought she was praying. She did not even glance up when he touched her shoulder. The coffin lid began to slide over them. The last thing Gabe saw were the red flames leaping up over the pit of tar. Then the lid closed, and there was nothing but complete blackness. "Gabe," Sari whispered, just seconds after the lid sealed shut. "I am frightened." For some reason, her confession made him snicker. She said it with such genuine surprise, as if being frightened was a startling new experience for her. "I am too frightened to be frightened," he whispered back. She grabbed his hand and squeezed. Her hand was even colder and clammier than his own. "He is crazy," she whispered. "Yeah, I know," Gabe replied, still holding on. "I think there are bugs in here," she said with a shudder. "I can feel them crawling on me." "Me too," he told her. He realized he was gritting his teeth. He always did that when he was nervous. And right now he was more nervous than he had ever believed was humanly possible. "Poor Daddy," Sari said softly. The air inside the coffin was already growing stuffy and hot. Gabe tried to ignore the disgusting sour smell, but it crept into his nostrils, and he could even taste it. He held his breath to keep from gagging. "We are going to suffocate in here," he said. "He is going to kill us before we can suffocate," Sari wailed. "Oh." He heard her slap at a bug on her arm. "Maybe something will happen," Gabe told her. It was pretty lame, but he could not think of what else to say. He could not think at all. "All I keep thinking about is how he is going to reach in and pull my brain out through my nose," Sari wailed. "Why did you have to tell me that, Gabe?" It took him a long moment to answer. All he could manage was, "Sorry." He began picturing the same horrible thing himself, and another wave of nausea rolled over him. "We cannot just sit here," he said. "We have to escape." "How?" Sari asked. "Let us try to push up the lid," Gabe said. "Maybe if we both push together." He counted to 3 in a low whisper, and they both pressed their hands flat against the coffin top and pushed up as hard as they could. Nothing, the lid would not budge. Maybe he locked it or put something heavy on top, Sari suggested with a miserable sigh. "Maybe," Gabe replied, feeling just as miserable. They sat in silence for a while. He could hear Sari breathing, sort of sobbing with each breath. He realized his own heart was racing, his temples throbbing. The image of the long hook came back to him, the one Ahmed would use to pull their brains out through their heads. He tried to force it out of his mind, but it would not leave. He thought about Halloween 2 years ago, when he had dressed as a mummy, and his costume had unraveled right in front of all his friends. Little did he know then that one day he would have a mummy costume that would never unravel. Time passed. He was not sure how long. He noticed his legs had fallen asleep from sitting cross-legged, so he stretched them out in front of him. The case was large enough that both he and Sari could lie down if they wanted to, but they were far too tense and terrified to even try. Gabe was the first to hear it, a scrabbling sound like something climbing quickly around the inside of the mummy case. He thought at first it must be Sari, but she grabbed his hand with her icy fingers, and he knew she had not moved. They both went still and listened hard. Something near them, something right beside them, bumped against the wall of the case. A mummy. Was there a mummy in there with them? a moving one. A soft groan drifted through the darkness. Sari squeezed his hand so tightly it hurt, and Gabe let out a sharp cry. Another sound. "Closer, Gabe," Sari whispered, her voice tiny and shrill. "Gabe, there is something in here with us." It is not a mummy, that is what Gabe kept telling himself, crouched in the suffocating darkness of that ancient coffin, heart hammering against his ribs. It is just a bug, a very large bug. The words looped in his mind like a broken record, and then something crept closer in the blackness, and both he and Sari shrieked. Then a voice cut through the dark, a whisper, urgent and familiar. "Where are you guys?" "Uncle Ben." Sari lunged past Gabe before he could even draw a full breath, throwing herself toward the sound of her father's voice. Gabe could hear her crying, though he could not see a thing in the total darkness of the sealed case. Uncle Ben kept saying he was okay, over and over again, his voice steady and deliberate, trying to hold his daughter together. Gabe demanded to know how he had escaped, how he had gotten from his mummy case into theirs. Uncle Ben explained it calmly. The Egyptians had built hidden escape hatches into many of their mummy cases, small doorways meant to allow the soul of the departed to slip free. Ahmed, so consumed by his obsession with ancient curses, had simply forgotten this very practical detail. There was no time to marvel at it for long. Uncle Ben told them Ahmed had vanished, possibly gone to wait for the tar to heat to the right temperature, or perhaps content to leave them sealed inside to suffocate. Either way, the path was briefly clear. Gabe felt something slither up his leg and slapped at it frantically, then followed Uncle Ben as the man groaned and turned himself toward the back of the enormous coffin. A small rectangle of pale light appeared as the hidden door swung open, just wide enough for a person to flatten themselves and squeeze through. One by one, they dropped onto the chamber floor. When Gabe's eyes adjusted, he got a good look at Uncle Ben and felt his stomach drop. There was a massive dark bruise spreading across the side of the man's head, and a wide ribbon of dried blood had tracked all the way down his cheek. Sari looked pale and hollow, her lower lip raw from where she had been chewing on it. The red flames still danced over the pit of bubbling tar, throwing blue shadows across the stone walls, and the mummies stood exactly as they always did, frozen and silent around the room, like a jury that had already reached its verdict. Uncle Ben took one look at the rope ladder in the center of the chamber and made a decision, too slow. He pointed them toward the tunnel instead, and all three broke into a jog. Gabe noticed, with a kind of numb absurdity, that his shoelace had come untied again. He did not stop. They were almost there. The tunnel entrance was just yards away, and for one shining, fragile moment, it felt like they were actually going to make it out. Then the tunnel filled with orange light. Ahmed stepped out of the darkness, torch raised, his face caught in a flash of surprise, before hardening into something colder and more frightening. All three of them skidded to a stop directly in front of him. "You cannot escape," Ahmed said quietly, and then louder, "You will not escape." He thrust the torch at Uncle Ben, who stumbled backward and crashed down hard on his elbows, crying out in pain. The sound drew a grim smile across Ahmed's face. He announced that Kala was angry, that the three of them had gone too far for the mercy of being preserved. They would not join the other violators of the chamber. For one terrible half-second, Gabe almost felt relief. And then Ahmed finished his sentence. They would die in the tar pit. Uncle Ben tried to reach him. He asked Ahmed to speak with them, calmly, rationally, as one scientist to another. Ahmed drove the torch at their backs like he was herding animals, gesturing with the long dagger at his hip, forcing all three of them toward the edge of the pit. The tar was boiling now, making horrible popping and sucking sounds, the low red flames rippling across its surface. The smell hit Gabe like a wall. The steam burned his face. He tried to pull back and could not. Ahmed told him they would jump, one by one. If they would not jump, he would push them. Gabe stood at the edge of that pit, dizzy with the fumes, the whole chamber tilting around him, and shoved his hands into his pockets, just to feel something solid, His fingers closed around a small, dry, familiar shape, the summoner. The little mummy hand he had carried with him everywhere, bought at a garage sale from a kid who had told him its legend, how it had once been used to call up ancient souls and spirits, how it had earned its name. He was not thinking clearly, he knew that. He was terrified and overwhelmed, and his mind was firing in every direction at once. Maybe he wanted to distract Ahmed or confuse him, or buy them even a few more seconds. Maybe somewhere deep down he was remembering that legend without meaning to. He spun around. He gripped the mummy hand by its slender wrist and raised it above his head as high as he could reach, and he waited. Ahmed stared at it, and nothing happened. Gabe stood in the chamber like a statue, one arm raised high, the little mummy hand lifted above his head. It felt as though he had been standing that way for hours. Sari and Uncle Ben stared at the hand. Ahmed lowered his torch a few inches, squinting at it, and then his eyes went wide and his mouth dropped open in pure shock. He cried out. The words tumbled from him in a language none of them had ever heard before, something ancient and strange, maybe Egyptian, maybe something older than that. Whatever it was, it had frightened him badly, because he took a step back, his face draining from surprise, into something that looked a lot like terror. The hand of the priestess, he cried, but before any of them could react to those words, something behind Ahmed stole every bit of their attention. Sari let out a low cry. All three of them stared over Ahmed's shoulder in pure disbelief. A mummy propped against the far wall appeared to lean forward. Another one, lying flat on its back, slowly began to sit up, creaking as it lifted itself from the floor, the vast chamber filled with motion. One mummy, then another, straightened up and stood tall. They stretched their bandaged arms above their featureless heads. Slowly, painfully, the air grew thick with the smell of ancient dust and decay as they climbed out of mummy cases, raised themselves from the floor, and took their first heavy, lurching steps. Their muscles groaned. Dust rose from their dry, dead bodies. They were dead, Gabe thought, all of them dead for so many years, and yet they were rising, staggering forward on those heavy, dead legs. Their bandaged feet scraped across the chamber floor as they gathered together into a slow, shuffling army. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound Gabe knew he would never forget. Bandaged arms outstretched, they lumbered toward the group, creaking and groaning, moaning softly with ancient pain. Ahmed caught the horror on their faces and spun around. He cried out again in that strange language as he saw the mummies advancing, and then, with a furious scream, he hurled the torch at the mummy in the lead. The torch struck the mummy in the chest and bounced to the floor. Flames burst across its bandaged body, spreading instantly over its arms and down its legs. But the mummy did not slow. It did not react at all to the fire consuming it. It simply kept coming. Babbling in open-mouthed terror, Ahmed turned to run. But he was too late. The burning mummy lunged, catching Ahmed by the throat and lifting him high above its flaming shoulders. Ahmed shrieked, a high and piercing sound, as the other mummies lumbered in around him, moaning through their yellowed bandages. Together they raised him above their heads and held him over the boiling, bubbling tar pit. Squirming and kicking, Ahmed screamed as the heat and tar fumes swirled through the chamber. Gabe closed his eyes. The steaming blackness seemed to pull at him from every direction. When he opened them again, he saw Ahmed fleeing for the tunnel, staggering clumsily, shrieking as he ran. The mummies had stayed by the pit, still and silent, as though they had claimed their victory and were satisfied. Gabe realized he was still holding the mummy hand high above his head. He lowered it slowly, then looked over at Sari and Uncle Ben. "The mummies," he managed to say. "Look," Sari said, pointing. Gabe followed her gaze and felt the breath leave his body. Every mummy in the chamber was back in place. Some leaned against the walls. Some lay on the floor. Some were propped at odd angles. They were exactly as they had been when the group had first entered the chamber, as though nothing had happened at all. Had they moved? Had they truly risen up, stood tall, and staggered forward? Or had all of them imagined it together? Number, they could not have imagined it. Ahmed was gone. They were safe. "We're okay," Uncle Ben said, his voice full of relief, throwing his arms around both of them. "We're okay. We're okay. We can go now," Sari cried happily, hugging her dad. Then she turned to Gabe, and what she said next seemed to cost her something real. "You saved our lives," she told him. She had to choke the words out, but she said them. Uncle Ben looked down at the object still gripped in Gabe's hand. "Thanks for the helping hand," he said. That night they had an enormous dinner back in Cairo. None of them could stop talking long enough to eat properly. They chatted over each other, reliving every terrifying moment, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Gabe spun the little mummy hand on the table as Uncle Ben grinned at him. "I had no idea how special that hand was," Uncle Ben said, picking it up to examine it closely. Then his expression turned serious. "Better not play with it. We must treat it carefully." He shook his head at himself. "Some great scientist I am. When I first saw it, I thought it was just a toy, some kind of reproduction. But this hand may be my biggest discovery of all. It is my good luck charm," Gabe said, gently taking it back. "You can say that again." Sari agreed. It was the nicest thing she had ever said to him. Back at the hotel, Gabe surprised himself by falling asleep the moment his head touched the pillow. He had expected to lie awake for hours, turning everything over in his mind, but the excitement had drained him completely. The next morning, the three of them had a big breakfast in the room. Scrambled eggs, frosted flakes, and a whole lot of laughter. The terror of the night before felt far away, and they were teasing each other and joking around like the whole ordeal had been something out of a dream. After finishing his cereal, Gabe lifted the little mummy hand dramatically above his head. "Oh, summoner," he chanted in a deep, theatrical voice, "I summon the ancient spirits. Come alive again. Stop it." "Gabe," Sari snapped, reaching for the hand. He swung it out of her reach, grinning. "That isn't funny," she told him. "You shouldn't fool around like that, are you, chicken?" he asked, laughing harder when he saw the genuine fear in her face. He raised the hand even higher. "I summon the ancient spirits of the dead," he chanted. Come to me now." There was a loud knock on the door. All three of them gasped. Uncle Ben knocked over his juice glass, and it clattered across the table, spilling everywhere. Gabe froze with the hand still raised in the air. Another knock, then a scrabbling sound at the door. The unmistakable sound of ancient, bandaged fingers struggling with the lock. Gabe and Sari exchanged horrified looks. Gabe slowly lowered the hand as the door swung open, and two shadowy figures lumbered into the room. "Mom and Dad," Gabe cried. He had never in his life been so glad to see them.